Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we are going to we're going to sort of retract a bit and talk about labor, but also labor and capital. But before we do that today, we're going to backtrack a bit and just touch bases, do a customary recap, and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed city life, the cities, the rise of the cities. We discussed the political machines, how they performed a great benefit to the urban immigrants, and also even to the old stock city inhabitants by performing a lot of the duties that modern municipal governments do now, that they perform now, but they did so at a cost. We examined George Plunkett and his definitions of graft, honest graft and dishonest graft, and how he openly and emphatically praised honest graft has both satisfying and gratifying for the immigrant, for the persons who are persons who are being benefited from the actions of the ward boss of the political machine, and then also the clogs, the members of the political machine who enriched themselves at the public's expense. And it was sort of viewed as a trade-off. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. It was sort of viewed in those terms. And lastly, we looked at settlement houses, the great Hull House, founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, how that set off a rush of settlement houses across the nation and a lot of the great cities to really care for the needs of the immigrant community, to sort of aid in the Americanization process, but also strike back at the political machines. And we also looked at how those Hull houses were impacted by segregation practices and by Jim Crow practices, and how they were how they did serve to sort of retard or hold back the African American community from joining in the American community as a whole, because they were segregated. Okay, and now with that being said, let's dive right in. And again, this upcoming lecture, part one and part two of labor and capital, they still dwell on the topics of immigration and urban life, living in the cities, the rise of the cities. And so to begin with, I just want to say that most of the city dwellers were working class people who were immigrants and migrants from the countryside. And these people had hoped to one day start their own businesses, so they didn't have any long-term goals of being wage earners. These people did not have long-term goals of being wage earners. They viewed their time as members of the working class as being temporary. But as the wealth gap widened, it became more and more difficult for them to do so. Many soon turned to trade unions to improve not just their job security, but their working conditions. And a number of them actually at this time began to reconcile the prospect of being members of the working class for the rest of their lives. A number of trade unions sprung up at this time. The Knights of Labor, an early trade union, failed to really accomplish any of those aims of improving job security, working conditions, and wages for industrial workers. With the failure of the Knights of Labor, many skilled workers banded together to protect their interests. And this led in 1886 to the founding of the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers. The workmen had learned a great deal from the railroad strike of 1877. And the lessons they had learned was that if you could keep the middle class on your side, your strike had a great chance of success. It was the more members outside of the working class community, um, the more people outside the working class community associated and sympathize with your cause, the more successful it will be. Now, um, the middle class Americans, they feared trade unions at this time because they thought that the trade unions were influenced by radical foreigners, dangerous foreign radicals. This fear became more widespread after the Haymarket riot that we already discussed. In the 1890s, had the Republic endured a bitter economic depression, and this depression lasted from 1893 all the way to 1897. Had the country endured this bitter economic depression, there were recurring acrimonious confrontations between unions and industrial leaders. The experience of these conflicts led Eugene Debs, a noted union leader, to form the Socialist Party and run as its presidential candidate in 1980. The liberty of contract doctrine really factors into sort of understanding the acrimonious nature between these disputes. In previous lectures, we noted that the scale of industrial work was growing and has the interpersonal relationship that characterized early workshops that faded away, and the bosses became more and more just remote figures. So too did the workforce. So too did the workforce begin to view their employers as sort of like the tyrannical figures, and these employers began to view the employees as simply one of many pieces in the industrial puzzle that could be replaced at will. Bosses were constantly trying to keep their costs down to maximize profits, and this meant mainly keeping wages low. A common line to respond to demands for wages increase was that if wages were increased, the company would become uncompetitive and fail. Employers also shielded themselves behind the liberty of contract doctrine, defending their actions by arguing that every man approaches the boss on his own. And between the boss and the workman, they hammer out the details of a contract for which work will be done and wages will be paid. Now, the reality was much more different because the workers had no other option than to accept work on the conditions and terms laid out by the bosses. They also had no other option but to accept the wage offered by the boss. One of the motivations for creating a union was that if all the employees could gather together, they could offset that inequality, that inequity, and negotiate from a position of strength with their employer, with the industrial leaders. Now, safety was also another major concern for the industrial workforce. Industrial work was very unsafe, particularly the railroads. During the time period of the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were literally 1,000,001 ways to die in industrial work. Before the invention of the air brakes, trained employed men known as brakemen, whose job, it was their job to ride on top of the trains and unscrew a mechanical wheel that unlocked that unlocked the brake, and they had to do all this by hand. It was a risky job because men were shaken off the trains by rough tracks, steep bends, and bridges. These were all on-the-job hazards. There were a number of accounts of men simply being crushed to death or horrifically scalded by steam in the boiler rooms, in the boilers, by the boilers of the trains. Carnegie steel plant itself was the home to one of the highest rates of industrial workplace injuries. It was estimated that about 20% of all the employees being injured or killed between 1907 and 1910 were Carnegie steel plant employees. And the worst, of course, the worst of these industrial calamities, these industrial workplace fatalities, was, of course, in 1911 at the Triangle Shirt Factory in New York City, where all 147 employees died in a fire. And it should be noted that there were no proper fire escapes or exits. the exits were locked. In order to keep the workers at their place, the employers bolted shut the exit. There was one way in, one way out. You had to ask permission, and the answer was always going to be no. You got break time. On break time, you did everything. You got one break. On that break, you had to take care of your bathroom needs, your food needs, everything. No ifs, ands, or buts. We have photographs of the fire, and of course of the aftermath of people jumping from windows from other floors as they tried to escape the flames. Another obstacle that workers faced was that if a state legislature took the initiative and cracked down on unsafe factories, the industries would simply pick up and migrate out of the state. Massachusetts was one of the first states to legislate on behalf of workers. Massachusetts was also the place, as you will remember, from our earlier lectures on American industrialization, on the textile industry and so forth. Massachusetts was also the place where the textile industry developed. The domestic textile industry first flourished in Massachusetts. We still have the remnants of those early industrial factories in Massachusetts. When the Massachusetts state legislature began to mandate workplace improvements rather than comply with these new state laws, the textile industry simply migrated to North Carolina and to Georgia, where the legislatures did not interfere with their business practices. The owners of these mills, these factories, did not have to restrict working hours. They didn't have to enact any sort of safety precautions, and there was no minimum hiring age for labor. This led to abuses of child labor in the textile industry, and children being sent to factories were prematurely aged from the demands of industrial labor. Illiteracy was very common, and many were unable to write their own names as a result of being uneducated or undereducated. As we discussed earlier, also in our previous lectures on the industrial workforce, on industrial labor, the chief impediment to trade unions were, of course, the lack of common interest among workers. The Knights of Labor, for example, they accepted artisans, unskilled workers, farmers, and even some small business owners were members of the Knights of Labor. They excluded bankers, lawyers, doctors, and liquor salesmen. Now, the Knights of Labor had a great sense of brotherhood and economic cooperation throughout the nation. It was really one of the first, it really sort of spearheaded this drive to unionize the railroad industry, which was one of the first to unionize, one of the first industry to unionize. The early union members to unionize based their jobs. They were based on their jobs, and they based everything on your skill set. So they would have firemen, and a fireman on a train was a man who shoveled the coal. Those men stuck together. Breakers stuck together. The men who went up there to do all that braking work, they stuck together. Conductors, they stuck together. Due to the large distances that the railways covered, the early unions had to develop better and more reliable techniques to maintain organization, cohesion, and efficiency. Now, strikes, as I stated earlier, strikes could prevail if the strikers enjoyed the support of the local community, especially the local middle class. In 1874, the workers of the Erie Canal went on strike. Because they had not been paid in months, and the management announced that when they did get around to paying the workers, they were going to cut their pay. Now, the strikers were very careful to avoid confrontation with the rail line and practice temperance. The strikers also removed the coupling pins from the train, preventing their departure. Now, they did that to all the trains except for mail trains because, of course, delivering the mail is a constitutional duty of the federal government. They didn't want to break any federal laws, so they didn't mess with mail trains. Now, the strikers also earned the respect of local journalists who praised their poise while criticizing the railway company. And it appeared it genuinely appeared as though the strikers were going to win, but sorry about that. The railroad company simply threatened to move to another town. And with this threat, the middle class residents lost heart and they turned against the strikers. And the strike collapsed. The workers had to go back to work, and they got reduced pay. They didn't get any of their stated goals or agenda. Okay, and with that said, we'll break here and we'll come back for part 2 of our lecture on labor and capital. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know specifically what you thought about this lecture, how you liked it, and I'll see you guys next time.